The eyes are useless when the mind is ignorant. What many black people are now seeing and perceiving, ignorantly perceiving, as being evidence of a slave syndrome, a biblical curse, or a generational curse, are all in fact the results of nefarious social sciences that have been deployed against us by white oppressive forces. Social science is one of the branches of science devoted to the study of human behavior, specifically how people interact with each other, behave, and develop and move forward as a society. It's also used to steer the societal objectives of the ruling class. This system was deployed against black people in response to the 1960s unprecedented unified protests to ensure that it never happens again. They started deploying social science to subjugate us. We must learn of all these social science tactics and then develop counter strategies to overcome them. It's the only way we'll ever liberate ourselves. The oppressor's greatest power is the ignorance of the oppressed. Therefore, the ignorance of the oppressed must be removed in order to strip the oppressors of their greatest power over us. Meeting this objective is the reason for these videos. I educate to liberate. Today we're going to discuss the topic of Black identity disassociation. These are the ones that often invoke emotional responses from the Black community. We often call them coons and sellouts. We merely dismiss them as being infected by the silly Willie Lynch myth. In reality, these are those black people that have been so heavily demoralized by the white society's perpetual fraudulent negative depiction of our racial group. The unrelenting humiliation has caused them to want to separate themselves from our racial group. Psychologists call this Black identity disassociation. It's a defense mechanism that evolves to put a distance between themselves and from the demoralizing pain associated with being Black, which is a direct result of the white society's unrelenting negative depictions of Black people. When virtually all information that Black people receive about ourselves from the white society are consistently negative, consistently Black racially demoralizing, it should come as no surprise that some Black people would want to separate themselves from our racial group. And in fact, should be well expected. Some Black people have been so demoralized by the white society's fraudulent negative depiction of our racial group that they've made it their personal mission to go and try to show white people that we're not all bad. It's a trauma bond response. Black people are within a trauma bonded relationship with a narcissistic white society. The term trauma bonded relationship is usually associated with individual abusive relationships, wherein which an abused person is trauma bonded to a narcissistic abuser. Here's how that's achieved. A trauma bonded relationship is when, after repeatedly brutalizing a partner in a relationship, the narcissistic abuser never apologizes for any of his wrongdoing. He instead minimizes the abuse and tells the victim that the abuse wasn't that bad and to just get over it. Or he tells the victim that the abuse was her own good and she deserved it. The abuser also constantly inundates the victim with demoralizing and disapproving narratives about the victim. This is continued until the victim stops focusing on the abuse and instead focus only on the demoralizing and disapproving narratives. Therefore, rather than resenting the abuser for the abuse, the victim instead tries to win the approval of the abuser. This trauma bonding effect provides the abuser with a more favorable outcome from the victim, rather than having the victim hating and resenting the abuser. It's a gaslighting tactic. Likewise, this same trauma bonding abusive manipulation tactic is what the white society has done to Black people. After brutalizing Black people for many centuries, the white society never acknowledged any of the horrible wrongdoings they've done to the Black population. They instead insist that the abuse of black people wasn't that bad, and they tell black people to get over it. Then, through their unrelenting false news reports, they keep telling black people how bad we are. And by inundating us with disapproving narratives about ourselves, they constantly inundate us with narratives disapproving and demoralizing propaganda. They also whitewash their textbook to claim that the white society's brutal enslavement of black people improved our lives. This causes many black people to doubt the severity of the abuse that our ancestors endured. And this has continued until black people stop, rather than resenting the white society for abusing us, many black people instead tries to win the approval of the white society. Many black people will go out of their way to try to win the approval of the white society, will go out of their way to try to show the white society we're not all bad. This is the truth of our plight and collective condition. Black people are within a trauma-bonded abusive relationship with a narcissistic white society. And just like within most abusive relationships, the white abusers have convinced many of their black victims to believe that the abuse we endure was our own fault. Therefore, instead of resenting the white society, many black people seeks to win the white society approval. It's a psychological mind hack. The minds of large targeted populations are quite easy to manipulate when people are unaware of what's being done to them. Once minds have been confused, manipulation becomes simple. The mind will even ignore common sense, and rationality falls away, even overlooking hypocrisy and deception. The weaker the black person's mental fortitude is, the stronger the trauma bond. The stronger the black person's mental fortitude, the weaker the trauma bond. Those who we're calling sellouts merely possess the weaker mental fortitudes. However, instead of calling and condemning these self-loathing, weaker-minded black people, it would be more productive to dismantle the trauma-bonding brainwashing system that deliberately creates their mindsets. Their mindset was deliberately created to produce what's called the buffer class. The buffer class black population. These are those black people that have been socialized to act as the buffer between the white society and the black population. Nowadays, before African Americans can even confront the system of white supremacy, we're first forced to fight against those black buffer class black people that have been brainwashed to defend the system of white supremacy. The same tactic was also implemented in South Africa, when the white apartheid government assigned the term colored and gave more privilege to the Indians that had migrated to South Africa as expats, and then subsequently to the mulatto brown skinned Africans who were the result of race mixing. Largely, this group allegiances was then made greater toward the white establishment that held power over them, rather than to the indigenous South Africans. Then whenever the indigenous South Africans attempted to confront the apartheid regime, they often found themselves in conflict with these coloreds, these buffer groups, therefore creating the buffer group between the white society and the indigenous South Africans benefited the white society. Likewise, in the same manner, creating a brown against a black protected the white establishment in South Africa, creating a buffer class that's between blacks and blacks benefits the white establishment in the United States. If you've been paying attention, you've probably noticed that every time white media controllers invite a black protester to plead our case on television, they also invite those members of the black buffer class to argue against us. These buffer class black people will even insist that white racism against black people doesn't exist. White media controllers will even give these black buffers national media platform that amplifies their rhetoric against the interests of the black population. I provided you with a brief overview of the truth of our plight and condition. The truth has finally come forward, but millions of black people have been conditioned to fear it and to hate those who speaks it. These are those black people that have literally been brainwashed to act as wardens of their own mental prisons. Millions of black people also refuse to accept the truth because of the inherent call for action that comes with accepting the truth. But when you hear the truth, and you know deep down within your heart and soul that it is the truth, and yet you still refuse to act upon it, it is then that your soul truly begins to die. Because that very moment proves to yourself that you are in fact mentally enslaved. It is time to wake up to the truth. One love and peace.